It's really great to be back with you again. And it's an extra pleasure because tonight I'm hosting a dear friend, Emma Seppala, who many of you know, and we're going to be talking about her best-selling book, The Happiness Track. If you haven't gotten it, I would highly recommend it. We will be selling it out front, and it really is a wonderful book. Emma has been working with me for a number of years now, and she has been our associate director, our science director. She's much better educated and smarter than I am, and I always try to surround myself with people like that because it makes me look good. So Emma has a BA from Yale in comparative literature and an MA from Columbia in, I'll get it, East Asian Studies, and a PhD from here at Stanford in psychology, where she studied, if I recall correctly, loving-kindness meditation. But beyond that, she is an incredible human being. She was instrumental in a recent film that came out that worked with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, utilizing breathing techniques, and we'll talk about that a bit. Additionally, and we'll probably be announcing this in the fairly near future, Emma has really been the key behind a new project that, I shouldn't say new, we've been working on it for about 1.5 years now, but it's the Handbook of Compassion Science, and that'll be published by Oxford University Press in the first quarter of next year, and that'll really be the definitive book that brings together all the latest literature in this domain. And really we've been blessed because, I do say blessed, and somebody will say, you say you're an atheist, how can you be blessed? I'm not even going to explain that today, but that happens a lot. But we're very blessed because really the leading scientists throughout the world have been gracious enough to contribute to that. So it should be really a wonderful text. ccare, if you don't know, and for those who've been to many of these, ccare is the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. This is an initiative which is based in the School of Medicine here at Stanford. It is an affiliate of the Neuroscience Institute at Stanford. Our mission is to really understand these complex behaviors of compassion and altruism from a neuroscience and psychology perspective, and also to explain the latest research going on in this domain in the context of the value proposition of these behaviors, in the sense that when one acts with compassion and altruistic intention, it really has a profound effect on your physiology in a very positive way. It shifts many people from this constant anxiety and stimulation of their sympathetic nervous system to increased tone of their vagal or vagus nerve, which results in really pushing the parasympathetic nervous system tone up, and that results in this sense of calmness, a feeling of behavior, and makes you really function at your best. And when you have that system engaged, it's also where your executive control function and your frontal area works its best. This allows you to be much more discerning and thoughtful, and it also is associated with this concept of flow, and it increases one's creativity as a result, and ultimately one's productivity. And this is in really every domain of life, whether it's the personal domain, the educational environment, business, healthcare. We're really seeing the power of this in essentially every domain in life, and this should not be surprising, since as a species we evolved to be compassionate, kind, caring, and nurturing. That really is our default mode. We just get confused sometimes by two other parts of our baggage, which are response to threat and a sense of tribalism, which oftentimes is associated with that. My name is Jim Doty. I'm the founder and director. Emma has been on this journey with ccare with me for many years, and really in many ways is greatly responsible for its success, so I thank her. And without further ado, Emma Seppala. Well, thank you for coming. Emma's now on the East Coast, back to her home school, Yale, where her husband's getting his master's. So although she's at a distance from us, she's still very close to us. So tonight we're going to talk about her book, The Happiness Track. And maybe, Emma, you could just tell us what was the motivation behind doing a book.
One of the things I was so surprised by when I became a graduate student at Stanford was the first year that I was here. I was so thrilled to be driving my bicycle down Palm Drive and in the sun, and I just couldn't believe how lucky I was. And that first year there were 3 suicides on the campus, and that really struck me. And then the longer I was here, I also saw that some of the most talented people are also burning themselves out so that they're becoming miserable, in fact. And when I looked at the data, I saw that we have this misconception that in order to be successful, we have to sacrifice our happiness. But if you look at the data, if we're happier, we're actually more focused, more productive, have better relationships, or more charismatic. The list goes on. So I was hoping it could provide some relief. And I myself, as you know, in Silicon Valley in general, I feel like you can just feel the tension in the air sometimes. And so I was hoping the book would provide some relief.
Well, I think it already has to a great many people. But it is sort of interesting because there's a sense that if you run faster, you get there faster. But sometimes running faster clouds your judgment and causes stress. And in fact, you're not getting there faster. You're in fact hindering yourself or hurting yourself.
Yeah, because as you were mentioning, that fight or flight response, that when it kicks in, actually our emotional intelligence is lower, our decision making is impaired, and our thinking, our attention, our memory, and that eventually with that chronic overload of stress, we become depleted.
Speaking of that, and maybe you could just go, and I know we've talked about this a few other times, but maybe you can just give a short overview of this evolutionary construct that on the one hand makes our species kind, compassionate, caring, nurturing, but then on the other hand has this other component which I just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know from research that we've, with our partners at ccare and other compassion researchers, is that compassion is very innate to us. In fact, I have a 18-month-old and I can see that already. He wants to help, he wants to feed me, he wants to help in whatever way he can. So, and we know that from research with infants and chimpanzees and other apes, that we have this natural tendency to want to help others. A rat in distress who sees a rat who sees another rat in distress will go out of their way to help them. So we know this is part of our evolution, but we also know that there's this other side that can come into play, and often it comes into play when we are in a state of stress and fight or flight. And we know that stress makes you very self-focused, and when you're self-focused, you're not able to connect, and your empathy may be impaired. In fact, there's research suggesting that it can impair empathy. And then we're not as able to connect, and then the compassion can go, but also our well-being and our happiness, because we know that happiness is so dependent on positive social relationships. And I think the research we've been doing at ccare has also shown that compassion is a huge secret to happiness.
No, absolutely. But maybe we can talk about this idea of connection, or what happens when you don't connect, or maybe early on you don't have bonding or connection with the people, and how that affects long-term health.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that we need that social connection from birth, infancy, all the way to old age, and it predicts our psychological health, our physical health, even our longevity. And when children don't have that connection, when they're very young and they're, what we call their attachment isn't secure as a child, then they can feel things like anxiety and have a sense of distance and disconnect from others, when actually what they're needing and seeking is that connection. But the good news is that even if you've had that kind of childhood, if in adulthood your relationships are very secure and loving, your attachment style can change. And that's the good news, is that we can always evolve and change, and that can improve our happiness, our well-being, our health, our longevity.
Yeah, a number of studies have shown that, growing up, when a child doesn't have this type of connection, it's associated not only with an increased frequency of disease, but also an increased severity of disease and is associated with increased rates of cancer or diseases, chronic diseases. It's very, very deleterious to one's health. And in fact, there's now been a term called ACEs. Have any of you heard of that? It's this concept of adverse childhood experiences. And there's this ever-increasing body of evidence that shows when a child is exposed to these types of negative experiences, in some ways it's like post-traumatic stress disorder. And children in those types of environments, which are generally associated with lower socioeconomic status, oftentimes, really have a very difficult time achieving because they have a chronic sense of stress, anxiety, which again, as we were just talking about, really has a very negative effect on long-term health. But as Emma was talking about, one of the things we're learning is that, like monks and other practitioners, some religious, some philosophical, have learned, and that I have learned, and Emma has learned, is that in fact, though, you can change the wiring of your brain, if you want to use that term, really with profound effect. And maybe you can talk about some of the techniques to do that.
Yes, well, so one of the research studies that I conducted just immediately before coming to ccare was with veterans with trauma, and they had just come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and most of them did not sleep at night, had very high levels of anxiety, lived bunkered up in their basement, used alcohol or pot to go to sleep at night, had tried therapy, it hadn't worked for them, had tried pharmaceutical drugs that hadn't worked for them. And when you look at the research, those traditional methods don't always work. They do in some cases, but many veterans fall through the cracks. And then again, if you have the courage to go to war, you're not the kind of person to want to depend on a therapist or on a drug, for that matter, or the side effects and so forth. And so we wanted to try something very simple and yet very powerful, which is using breathing techniques, because the fight or flight response they seem to be locked in a state of permanent fight or flight, which is why they're not able to relax and let go and sleep, for example, or which is why their startle response is very, very high to things that we wouldn't even notice, like a bang on the wall or something like that. So we did a breathing intervention with them for 1 week, and what we know about breathing is that it taps into your parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve that Dr. Doty was just talking about, and in that soothing, calming response. And in 1 week, we saw that their anxiety decreased to subclinical levels, and that improvement lasted 1 year out. So it wasn't, if you send someone to the gym for a week or massage every day, maybe they'll have that same response, but it wouldn't last. And it did. And so what we're seeing is that breathing, for example, is one way that can really rewire your system, allow you to tap back into your natural calming response, natural inner resilience that we all have to stress, but that sometimes in the case of trauma is somehow blocked. And then other practices are ones that we've researched at ccare, the compassion training programs that really foster that sense of connection, of kindness, that we also know is a huge predictor of health, happiness, well-being, longevity. It's, I think, the best kept secret to happiness, and yet all the marketing leaders out there are trying to tell us to purchase this, get this, look like this. And whether we want to or not, those messages are really strong. And how often do you hear someone say, oh, you want to be happier? Be kind to other people, support other people. We don't hear that. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I talked about this actually yesterday, but one of the challenges is that media is interested in selling, right? It's either selling you to watch what they're promoting or selling you products that they promote. And because of this fight or flight response, we have a tendency, if everything is going great, we're not necessarily even interested in TV, we're connecting with other people, and threat is not on our radar screen in the context of if you're having a good relationship or you feel comfortable. So how do you sell media? Well, we as a species respond immediately to threat. So what do you promote on TV? You promote things that cause this sense of response, and you'll turn your head whether it's war coverage, whether it's violence, whether it's politicians spewing hatred and misogynist, or maybe one politician. I shouldn't say that. But this is how we respond, unfortunately. And when you're engaged in that type of thing, immediately your sympathetic nervous system is engaged. And then, of course, it's interesting because, and you probably agree with this, I think, that when people do not sell things or promote things or give money to sell things unless it works, right? And it's sort of interesting because millions of dollars are spent by companies to sell their agenda. And on the other side of the coin, though, there's this argument that, well, I'm not influenced by a lobbyist. I'm not influenced by a pharmaceutical company. I'm not influenced by X, Y, or Z. But if you just follow how much money is spent and how it relates to decision-making, on a subconscious level, it has a huge impact. What's fascinating, though, is that the practices, I think, that are in your book and that we talk about often are derived from spiritual or religious practices that have been around for thousands of years. And you see in those cultures, which are associated with connection and family, that when they have shelter, when they have security, when they have food, people are actually quite happy. But these people leave these cultures, which are often in third world countries, to come to the United States. And what do we have here? We have epidemic rates of anxiety, stress, and depression. Can you imagine over the last few decades that a large percentage of children are now on psychotropic medications for behavior? I mean, and it's not because they need it. And now I'm not going Tom Cruise on you here, but it's because it's being sold as a solution.
Right.
And I think that you've seen, and the studies show, that in fact these types of practices really get rid of the need oftentimes. Now, this is not to say that every psychological disorder or every type of depression can benefit only from this. I think probably in most cases it can benefit, but in many cases it's not going to get rid of it necessarily, and there are places for some of these medications. But if you look at how it's sold over the last many years, and in fact, maybe you can comment that there are now studies that show that these types of practices are actually better than medication.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. Especially as a physician, you see this world from the inside, and what we are. The kind of mentality that we're adopting is, okay, I have some problem, let me take some pill. And we forget that we have the inbuilt ability to be resilient in many cases. And we just haven't learned to tap into it because we're used to looking outside. So I want to share an example of how breathing, how powerful it can be. There's a friend of mine that is now a friend that I didn't know before, but he was on one of the most stressful convoys you could ever imagine, stressful commutes you could imagine. And I know the commutes here in the Bay are stressful, but this one was a convoy in Afghanistan, a Humvee convoy, and he was the last Humvee in the convoy, the officer in charge. So everything was going just fine. There were so many cars that had gone ahead of him, and yet his hit an improvised explosive device, and there was a huge explosion. When he looked down, his legs were severed below the knee. He could see blood, bone, tissue. And in that moment, he remembered a breathing practice that he'd learned in a book that's given to officers, some officers. And in that book, they were taught a breathing technique for stressful moments, in which you breathe in for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, out for a count of 4, and hold for a count of 4. So kind of like a square. In that moment, somehow this came to him. And so he started to do this breathing, and that gave him the presence of mind to check in on his men as the officer in charge. Is everyone okay? It gave him the presence of mind to give orders to call for help. It gave him the presence of mind to tourniquet his own legs. It gave him the presence of mind to prop those legs up so he wouldn't bleed out. And only after he knew that everything was okay did he allow himself to faint. And later he was told if he had not done that, if he had not had the presence of mind, he would have bled to death or he would have fallen into a coma. And so this is just so huge. We think, oh, breathing, whatever, we do it all the time. It's so powerful. And these techniques really teach us how to access our own inner resilience, and so much to be said for them.
Yeah, I think what happens is that people don't appreciate the power within themselves. And we relegate that power to external forces, thinking taking a pill, listening to somebody like us, solves every problem. And it doesn't. But as I've said before, and I think you've said, you can't release yourself from a prison unless you know you're in the prison. And by people and books that sort of acknowledge the power of this, it gives you a set of tools, or a toolbox, if you will, that allows you to actually get this presence and understand the power within yourself. It's interesting because how many of you are familiar with the placebo effect? So imagine a significant percentage of drugs, when compared to placebo, even up to 75%, will have an effect on the people. 75% of people who get the placebo in a drug-controlled trial, looking at a particular effect, will have the effect of the drug that is given to them. I mean, how is that even possible? Yet, without any training whatsoever, people are able to do this. And it's really quite fascinating, because if I ask you to do it, you couldn't do it. But if you just, in a subconscious level, believe enough, it automatically happens. And so we do have this amazing power. I mean, literally, we can give people a sugar pill and tell them that it will have a profound effect on their white count or their immune system, and suddenly you'll see this incredible effect. So the thing is, we know we have the power. It's how do we give you the tools to access that power? And you see people who've been able to access it and do really extreme types of exercise, or control their heart rate, their blood pressure, their body temperature. Mm-hmm. We even see this in monks. Yeah. But, oftentimes I think people say, geez, it's too hard, or, how could I do that? I've tried X, Y, or Z. It's like dieting, right? But what works is Suzanne Summers' Abdominizer. It's interesting because people buy these things, and within 2 weeks, over 98% of them are never used again. Can you imagine that? And I have an Abdominizer at home. But maybe you can give us some ideas or tips of recognizing that it's not necessarily easy, but how do you get over sort of the hump of saying, geez, I tried X, Y, or Z and it didn't really work?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the placebo point you made is so interesting. And there's a researcher here in the psychology department, Brian Knudsen, who did this really interesting study. So you might have heard, monks or different spiritual traditions that say, happiness is within, just access it. And it's like, okay, how? But what he did was this study where he had people look at a desirable object. I don't remember what it was. Let's say it was like a piece of cake or something. And he looked at their brain both when they were watching it and then when they were given it, that whatever that was. And he found that just by watching it, you're releasing dopamine. The dopamine that you also release when you actually consume it. So what does this mean? We're producing that very joy that we believe is coming from something else. And that is so fascinating, because when I first heard that, I thought, this is what great teachers of the past have been telling us, and yet it's something that we think, again, I need something outside to make me happy. And we have this in ourselves. And then to your other point, also with the practices, I think it's been really interesting that mindfulness has gotten so much attention. And so a lot of people say, well, I've tried meditation, it doesn't work for me, I just can't do it. And then you say, well, what have you tried? And they're like, well, I tried mindfulness. And I always say, find the shoe that fits for you, because different practices fit different people. And I think it's really interesting that mindfulness has been so attractive to researchers, in particular, why not compassion meditation, loving kindness meditation, or so many others, is that mindfulness is exactly what scientists do. It involves observing your thoughts, labeling your thoughts in an objective way.
Or non-judgmental.
Non-judgmental. So observing, labeling, and objectivity. That's what scientists do. So I think they're just like right and comfortable in their paradigm. It's just they're in their comfort zone, and that's why that's gotten so much attention. And mindfulness is wonderful for some people, and for others, there's so many other practices that might fit them better.
Yeah, I mean, one is breathing that you were talking about. I wanted, before I forgot, to get back to that. What's the name of the movie? Because I know a lot of people would be interested. It's a very, very powerful movie.
Yeah. The movie is called Free the Mind, and it follows several of the veterans. And the veterans, they learn this breathing practice through an organization called Project Welcome Home Troops. And if as a community member you're interested in learning the practice, you can learn it through Art of Living. And they have a lot of classes in the Bay Area.
Actually, when you mentioned change comes from within, right? Mm-hmm. You remind me of a Dalai Lama joke. Have you ever heard this joke? Mm-hmm. So the Dalai Lama is in New York, and he's going down the street, and he sees a hot dog vendor. And he goes up to the guy, and he's hungry. This is a cheesy joke. So he says, "Make me one with everything." No, wait, we're not done. We're not done. And he hands the guy a $20 bill, so he gets his hot dog. So he doesn't get any change. So he says, "Where's my change?" And he says, "Change only comes from within." Have any of you guys seen this YouTube video with this Chewbacca lady? Have you seen that?
No.
I'm not trying to divert from the conversation, but this lady got a Chewbacca mask, and it's a plastic mask that fits on your face. This is about joy and making you happy and relaxed. So she puts this mask on, and she's doing a self-video, and I guess she's just like this, somewhat overweight lady, but she just overflows with joy. And she puts this mask on. She's talking about her kids, and this is her mask. She's not going to let her kids steal it from her. But this looks like a Chewbacca, and the jaw's articulated. So when you put it on, if you open your mouth, it goes, "Ah!" like Chewbacca. And she just starts giggling over this. This has now been viewed by 140 million people. Can you imagine? And in fact, she was on some TV show, Late Late Show. But this is in some ways related to this in the sense that we have within us to create this joy and this sense of comfort and relaxation, and even something as stupid or crazy or as a Dalai Lama joke or this Chewbacca mask, really simple things can be just so powerful if we allow ourselves to be present for that. And maybe you can comment about presence and how so many people may not be present and why that is, and maybe a solution to that.
Yeah. So there's an interesting study out of Harvard that tracked people with Blackberries, and these Blackberries would beep at random times of the day and ask, "What are you doing? How are you feeling? And what are you thinking about?" So what they found is that 50% of the time we're not thinking about what we're doing. So maybe, how many of you have had your mind wander?
I will tell you that doesn't happen in neurosurgery.
Oh, yeah. Hopefully. How many people have had your mind wander since we started talking? We won't be offended. Okay, it means you're normal, because 50% of the time our mind seems to wander. But I think that's probably increasing more now with the technology, because not only are we interrupting ourselves with our mind wandering, but we interrupt what we're doing to check our technology, sometimes compulsively. So it's really interesting. And but what the scientists found was that we're never more happy than when we're in the present moment, not even if you're doing something you don't like. So you might think, "Oh, I don't like doing the dishes, so I'm going to daydream about Hawaii," or something like that. You're happier if you're actually 100% with those dishes than if your mind is wandering.
You know, it's interesting because saying that, and how many of you have read or know Thich Nhat Hanh? So, you know, he talks about walking meditation, but you can do this type of practice, and this is what reminded me when you said dishes, of just being present while you do dishes. You know, at my house, I have, on my backyard, I have a concrete scape around a pool, but for a design reason, the architectural guy, landscape guy, said, why don't we put rocks between these things? Well, I thought it was a great idea, except I have a 7 and a 12-year-old and a dog, and these stones are loose. So every time I come home at night, these stones are scattered all over the thing. But one of the greatest joys I have is I come home and I walk around and put all the stones back. But the thing is, I don't think about anything except putting those stones back. And it's like a completely relaxing activity that puts me exactly present, and I'm not thinking about operating on somebody or some other stressful activity. And you really don't, when you put yourself into an activity, really put yourself into it, it really has the most amazing effect. Now, my wife always looks at me, asks me why I'm in the backyard pushing these stones around. But that's another issue.
Yeah. Well, it's incredibly freeing when you're in the present moment. And there's research that was conducted on people who are able to be so completely present, like you when you're doing your surgery or with the stones, and that you enter the state of flow, which is an extremely pleasurable state where you forget that time is passing, you forget anything else, you're so in love with what you're doing at that moment. And that's something that is also extremely, you know, we're looking to be more productive and this or that, but it's also very joyful. The other thing, too, is that when you're in that state of presence and relaxation like you were, and I'm jet lagged, so I walked around Palo Alto at 5 o'clock in the morning today. It was really quiet, and it was so joyful. I didn't have my cell phone, and I was just present with this beautiful downtown that we have.
But, you know, the sad thing is, and we see this at places like Stanford or in high-powered environments, the thought of doing that, people say, I'm wasting my time, right? And this comes back, have you ever heard this saying? This monk is talking to a person. He says, the monk says to him, you should meditate at least 20 minutes a day. And the person says, well, I don't have enough time. And he says, well, then you should meditate an hour a day. And it's really true, because those types of activities center you and allow you to be present. And what people don't appreciate is, as a species, we have evolved, and we're probably the most evolved species that has a perception of a past and ruminates on what I should have done, could have done, didn't do, and a perception also of a future with uncertainty. And what happens when you have uncertainty is, for many people, it creates anxiety. And some people argue that the creation of religious practices, or a belief in a God, or is a result of being able to diminish your anxiety, this existential crises about not knowing what's going to happen in the future. And so this is where we spend at least 50% of our time, either in the past or the future. And you know, an animal, or remember, our DNA has not changed over the last 200,000 years. So we are the same person that was on the savannah in Africa. And what's interesting is that, you know, if there was a threat, you responded to it, and either you died or you lived. But whatever the case, you were right back to where you were. But after that event occurred, you're right back to doing whatever it is you do. And you're not sitting there going, geez, if I should have done this or I should have done that. And that's what so many of us do. And this is why animals, what's incredible is most animals don't ruminate on the argument they had with the other animal, right? And how it's going to affect their future, or whether they're going to get a promotion, right? And they're not sitting there planning to marry the pretty other animal next week, right? So they're truly in the present. And what's amazing is here we've evolved as a species so we don't have to be in the present, which creates all the anxiety. So maybe we, instead of evolving, we should devolve back to...
Well, what's really interesting, too, is not only do we have this mind that can lead to anxiety, but we choose an adrenaline-filled life. We choose to, many people, to over-caffeinate, over-schedule ourselves, wait till the last minute to get things done. There's this idea you have to have adrenaline or you can't be productive.
Are you attacking me?
You're so not like that. You're one of the most relaxed. Dr. Doty performs surgery, runs a center, is on God knows how many boards, travels across the country doing book talks. And every time I talk to him, I'm like, how are you? And he says, I'm just peachy. You're one of the happiest people I know.
I never get stressed. Except, well, the only person who stresses me is my wife. And I'll tell you, and like she'll say, if she gets mad at me, and I deserve to get mad at sometimes, because believe me, I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but she will sometimes say, when she's really mad, she says, you call yourself Mr. Compassion, well, you're a, and I won't finish what she But so, what can I say?
But one of the things I've noticed about you is that you're incredibly creative and insightful. And that ties into that idea of presence, because so CEOs across industries are, when asked what's the number one trait you're looked for in incoming employees, and this is across industries and countries, they say creativity. And yet, these days, in order to be the most creative, innovative, disruptive people tend to focus so much on their niche, read up everything about it, become the absolute expert so that you can find the best way to disrupt the industry. And yet, research shows that we're our most creative when we're not focused, when we're not working, when we are in that space between sleep and wake, in that space when you're daydreaming. So in the past, we'd wait for the bus and we'd just wait for the bus. But now we're on our phone all the time. From morning till evening, we never have those moments of daydreaming. So we see that still in kids. And if you notice, kids are some of the most creative people in our society. And yet, we don't access that. So doing what you're doing, like, I can see that brings out, Dr. Doty's also an interior designer and architect. So he has the most incredible house that he built out of his own design. But in order to access that creativity, a lot of people think, I'm just not a creative person. We all are. But we have to access that part of our brain, that delta mode, when those insights come. That's why you have insights in the shower or right before sleep. And Salvatore Dali, do you know what he used to do?
No,
I think you might be interested in this. To incite his creativity, he would sit in a chair and he wanted to access that place right before sleep. So he had this key that he would hold in his hand, and there was like a metal plaque on the floor, and he would just close his eyes and go into that daydreamy mode, which you could also think of as a meditative state of mind. And whenever he'd fall asleep, he'd let go of the key, it would fall with a bang, and he'd wake up.
And he would remember his thoughts. Right?
Yeah. So that was his way of accessing that. But what this shows is that our incessant need to be productive and to work every moment of the day is actually impairing our greatest ability. Because creativity, which is what we need, whether you're a mom or an employee or a leader, but it also brings a lot of joy. And I think that's one of the reasons that you're always so joyful, because you're always brimming with ideas and enthusiasm.
I'm paying her for this.
Well, he's one of my heroes.
Well, she's mine, too. This is a mutual love fest. That's with all the people who work at ccare. And where's Jessica? Oh, she's hiding. So Jessica works with... Is Dong here?
Yeah, right next. Oh.
Is Dong here?
She's over there.
Oh. See, Jessica and Dong work with me, and Monica there's Monica. Raise your hand, Monica. But these are incredible people who allow us to do what we do. But again, and they're not all women just because I choose only women. I'm not a opposite of a misogynist, whatever that term is. But everyone who works with us really has this joyful attitude. And the reason is because there's this excitement. And it's these techniques that we're talking about here that have allowed you to wake up every morning and be ecstatic about what you're doing and wanting to connect and care with people. And this is really the power of these types of practices, because when you function in that way, you have the sense of calmness about you, this joy. And it's interesting, and maybe you can comment on this, how people respond to others' presence and how it affects them physiologically?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I interviewed two incredible minds in the chapter on creativity. One is Myron Scholes, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and the other is Pico Iyer, who is a phenomenal writer. And both of them are extremely creative and have these amazing insights that have helped them develop their work. And what is common among them, both of them, is that they take time to retreat. They take time to completely unplug from what they're doing. Myron plays golf. He does breathing every day. He meditates. And Pico, who's a current events journalist for the New York Times and Time Magazine, goes on retreats for weeks at an end, disconnected from everything.
And he's never owned a cell phone.
And yeah. And he's a current events writer in the West, but he lives in Japan. But what we're seeing
Well, the other key to his happiness is his wife doesn't speak English.
But both...
Pico's a friend of mine. Pico, I'm just kidding. But actually, he and his wife have this wonderful relationship. But she doesn't speak that much English. But he says that actually forces him to speak in other ways, because again, you don't appreciate how touch, tone of voice, and this gets back to presence, has an effect on how people respond to you. In my own book, which I'm not trying to push, but it is for sale out there with Emma's book. But one of the things that I tell people is that for myself, I did not appreciate as a child the anger and feeling of hopelessness and despair affected my behavior and interaction with other people. And what you find is that when you change how you react to the world, it results in the world changing how it reacts to you. And if you do have this sense of joyfulness and enthusiasm, it not only makes you more creative and productive, but people want to be with you and connect with you and feel that energy. And it's this thing that really all of us have, I think.
Yeah, and what's interesting is some people think, well, if I take care of my own happiness, isn't that selfish? And yet, if you're happy, it's one of the most altruistic things you can do, because research also shows that if we're happy, it impacts 3 degrees of separation away from us. So if you're happy, then your colleague's wife's child is happier. Whatever's 3 degrees away. And so it's incredible because... And you can think about it this way. I'm sure we all know the kind of person that walks into the room and just lights it up, the kind of sunshines. You know, there are people around us like that. And whenever they come in, they uplift us. We feel lighter. We laugh with them. And so those individuals, they impact everyone around them all day long. And that's something that we can all do. And uplifting other people. So it's really not a selfish thing at all.
No, in fact, I'm not going to tell another Dalai Lama joke, but the Dalai Lama says that being kind and compassionate actually is one of the few times that it's okay to be selfish, because you're actually getting great benefit from those types of actions. And we know this. I mean, it's interesting, and this was Bill Harbaugh's study, and maybe you can comment on that if you recall, with the college students and giving them money to give to others.
Yeah, so he looked at their brains when they were receiving money into their account versus when they were seeing money being deposited into account of a nonprofit organization that was going to benefit others. And he saw the same level of activation, pleasure activation in their brain. And in fact, another study also gave half of the participants, I think it was $20 to spend on themselves, and the other half $20 to spend on someone else. And at the end of the day, asked them who's happier. And it was those that had spent the money on other people that ended up being happier.
And the other thing is, an interesting part of that study was that at one point in the study, you could voluntarily give money to others, and you had this, again, sense of activation of your reward or pleasure centers in your brain. But even if you were forced to give money to others through the process of this, and you would have the same degree of activation as if you voluntarily gave the money to someone else. So it shows you that even at a subconscious level, when you give to others and benefit others, it has an effect on you. And again, it gets back to this idea of how we are hardwired to care. Because from an evolutionary perspective, to have what we call theory of mind and to have a complex language, abstract thinking, it has required that our offspring are cared for by us for a decade and a half or 2 decades, in my case 3 decades apparently. But if we don't care for them, they cannot survive. Unlike other species, they run off into the forest or swim away. Our offspring absolutely require that. And the thing that they have, though, is this incredible ability to sense emotional states. Because of the energy and resource cost of that caring, we have to get rewarded. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, we're actually programmed to be empathic. So a lot of people think, oh, well, what if I'm not really empathic or compassionate? But actually, just by looking at someone else's facial expression, you are internally mimicking it. The micro muscles in your face are activated when you see someone smile or frown, which is why, and you've often talked about this, when someone comes in the room that you know very well and something's wrong, you know something's wrong before they've said anything because you've felt it automatically, and that's the reason you cringe when you see someone trip and fall, for example. So we're very much wired and so attuned, and so much gets communicated without words. I would say maybe even more communication happens without words, because physiologically we're constantly, we're like sounding boards, very refined sounding boards for one another's feelings. That's why someone comes in the room and they're very angry. You were having a great day, and all of a sudden you're really angry, and you said, "What happened?" Because and that's called emotional contagion. But it's also the basis of empathy and compassion, because when we feel another person suffering and are motivated to help, that's when that compassion comes into play.
Maybe you could talk about, and Viktor Frankl, I think, defined this as this tendency when there is a stimulus, there is a response, but there's a pause between the response. And this idea of how we respond in between that pause, or what we feel.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, in that moment, which when you're under a lot of stress, sometimes you don't have that ability, that mindfulness come into play, which is why sometimes when people are stressed, they don't act empathically. But, and that's why practices like meditation, compassion meditation, so forth can be so powerful, because they kind of expand. It's as if they expanded that space between what you're seeing and how you're responding, so you have more choice in how you respond. So some people, when they see suffering, feel really distressed, and they don't want to have anything to do with it because they feel really uncomfortable. But what research is showing through our colleagues is that compassion meditation, when practiced over time, you actually become hardier in the face of suffering, so you can see the suffering, feel the suffering, and yet you have that resilience and that strength and that ability to actually help without being distressed.
And so it allows you, again, because when you go off the rails, if you will, and what I mean by that is where did I say to turn off your cell phones here? Sorry about that. When you go off the rails, and what I mean by that is where you don't appreciate that your sympathetic nervous system is engaged, it does not allow you to have a discerning response. Because what happens to many of us in our daily lives, especially in the modern world, is somebody comes at you in an aggressive fashion, and how do you react usually? Like that child. But he needs a Chewbacca mask. But what happens for many of us is you immediately take an aggressive attitude, right? Because somebody's coming at you in a threatening way. And you're assuming that it is you that they're angry, upset, or threatened by. And the reality is that more often than not, it has nothing to do with you. Many people react, as an example, if you left the house after having a big argument with your partner, and that's where your head is, and you still are in this emotional state. When you meet somebody, oftentimes you imitate that or let off steam to that person, and then the person, of course, gets angry at you, and now you've justified why you were angry at them because they're angry at you. And the thing is, so many times that these types of interactions really have nothing to do with us at all, yet we assume they do. And this whole idea of mindfulness and using these types of practices to really have that thoughtful pause between your reaction. And let me give you an example, which I think you and I have talked about, which is, what is, if you were driving and the type of situation, your commute that we were just talking about, where it's an hour long, or you're just bumping to bumper traffic, and somebody cuts in front of you, you almost have an accident, you have to slam on your brakes. Two things usually happen. Do you know what those are? One has to do with a hand movement. And the other has to do with saying usually a four-letter word, or true? Or all of you just remain calm and sedate. Well, but, and this is about also reframing, because if I said to you that, you have this immense anger and you say, that person tried to cheat and cut in front of me, they were so not thoughtful and what a jerk they are. But what if I had you reframe it in your mind and said, well, it turns out that the driver of the car, he's driving his wife to the hospital. She's 9 months pregnant. She's broke her water. She's bleeding. Are you going to have the same reaction? Now, as soon as I describe that, what happened to you? You're going, God, geez, it's okay. Please, I'll guide you to the hospital, or, let me help you, right? But before I reframed it for you, you agreed with me that they were a complete jerk, right? But we have this ability, and this gets back to our own power within us, to reframe situations. As an example, if somebody come on to you very aggressively, and instead of you saying, you're a jerk too, if instead you say, Bill, I'm surprised you're acting this way because you're such a wonderful, nice person. What happened to you today, and is there something I can do to help you? Mm-hmm. And what happens there? It completely diffuses the situation, because you can't fight with one person, right? You have to have two people. So you've completely diffused the situation. You've made them pause because they were waiting for you to get angry, and then they have an internal reflection of what it is that's motivating that behavior.
It's really beautiful, and there's now a whole body of research showing that compassionate attitude has an incredible impact on organizations and workplaces, where workplaces that are happier, more compassionate, are more productive, have greater loyalty, greater retention, greater engagement, and greater results in so many ways. And yet we still believe in this dog-eat-dog, a sink or swim, carrot and stick approach. And so one of the examples I talk about in my book is your story in the surgery room when you were a beginning surgeon, and then what you would have done, what you now have done with someone else in the same situation.
Yeah, well, thank you for putting this in. Well, actually, this is a story that I tell. One of my first experience in the operating room was working with a surgeon who was a prima donna and, frankly, really a jerk. He is the epitome of the biggest twit that you can imagine as a surgeon. And what happened was, I was so nervous. It was my very first time in the operating room. And, we have to wear a mask. And what you learn later, which I didn't learn before, is you put tape over your mask. So as you breathe, the thing, and I wear glasses at the time, I was wearing glasses at the time, so your glasses don't fog up. So I was so anxious that I was profusely sweating. And I'm watching this operation, and I'm seeing my glasses completely fog up. And I'm seeing a drop of water on my nose, and then I watch it fall off of my nose into the operating field. And what do you think this guy did? He didn't say, that's okay, Jim, I know it's your first time in the operating room. No, he did not. He screamed at me and threw me out of the operating room. Now, as a young surgeon, what do you think that does to you? I mean, it absolutely destroys you. I leave, I go, oh God, I've ruined my career. Maybe I shouldn't be a surgeon. I'm such a jerk. I know nothing. And the thing was that, fortunately, I had already decided he was a jerk, so his opinion didn't matter to me anymore. But
well, and also you mentioned that sweat could be easily irrigated. It wasn't a big deal.
No, it didn't. This does happen. But and again, if you're thoughtful, you just irrigate out. It's not usually a big deal. But the point is that you don't have to be that way. And this is again the same type of reactivity, being much more thoughtful and discerning if you think it through. And I've had residents do things like this and say, listen, here's why we do X, Y, or Z. Here's why we put tape on your mask. Don't worry about it. Be thoughtful about this. Don't let it happen again. But really, this is just the start. You think about this, but you really have a great future, and you're going to do just fine. Don't worry about it. Now, what's the difference between those two? The other sits there in that situation, and when you give somebody a break like that, they love you, right? And they want to be with you. While this person, I never, ever wanted to see him ever again. Now, to tell you the end of the story, which is the funny part, which I always tell jokes, so I can't help it. But so we were on rounds with this same surgeon later. And this guy was such a twit. And there was a female surgeon resident there. There was a fellow, myself, as the medical student, and the surgeon. So we're making rounds. And this guy would just be so mean and demeaning. So he asked this female resident to define a hernia. And she said, well, sir, it's a piece of tissue pushing out into an area where it's not supposed to be. So he looks at her and he says, well, what's this? And she said, well, that's an asshole. And that was probably the most joyous experience I've ever had. And he just turned bright red and just turned around and walked away, and we didn't see him the rest of the day. So so I still have the deepest respect for the courage of that young lady and what she did. But anyway. Well, actually, tell me about the experience you're having with this book, because, Emma has written for Psychology Today and the Harvard Business Review and a variety of magazines about her work, but really what she has written about, which is all science-based, people are having really a profound effect from this because of this. So maybe tell us about your experiences or how people have reacted to the book.
Well, it's been really joyous for me because I've had some people you wouldn't necessarily expect to engage with this material, like investment bankers and CEOs, write to me and say, "I just got the book for our entire staff," and really coming to understand the data that a happier workplace is a more productive, sustainable workplace, and that this old model of dog eat dog, which is very much at work in a lot of organizations, actually is detrimental and leads to much greater turnover. I was speaking yesterday to someone who works in a very big Silicon Valley company, and she told me that the average tenure there is 7 months. So you're talking about, and if you know I think the expense of replacing someone is 30% of that person's yearly salary. So you're thinking about the expense of that. And of course, what about the psychological expense of people burnout? There's 50% burnout across industries in the US. There's 70% of the American workforce is disengaged. We're facing a problem here. But a very funny email that I got from someone, she said, "I'm so excited. I read your book and I decided I want to be more present. And I have this to-do list and I keep it in my Google Drive so I can edit it every moment of the day. It's color coordinated and has multiple columns, and I keep adding to it. And it's driving me crazy. So you know what I did? I deleted my to-do list forever." I was like, wow. So she's very happy apparently, and I guess still getting things done. So that's good.
Well, it is sort of interesting because sometimes when you start trying so hard, everything becomes easier. And because when you're trying so hard, you're not present and you're not as productive. And when you put yourself in this state and relax, this engages, again, your parasympathetic nervous system and your executive control function. And again, it increases your creativity. and productivity. And what's interesting is so many people feel that they have to always look busy. Have any of you guys experienced that? Right? If you're at work, there are other people, and you don't even have anything to do, and you're going, And the thing is, it's okay not to do something sometimes. And even for myself, actually, what I do in my office, as soon as I feel tired, I just go lay on the floor. Because I'm tired. And the thing is, though, what happens with so many people, they would never think of doing that. Now my assistant comes in and looks at me laying on the floor sometimes, but it's okay. But again, it gets back, though, to so many people are so concerned about what others think of you. Do any of you feel that way? And this is part of the problem, right? Is because instead of being compassionate to yourself, being kind to yourself, you have all this angst about whether you're making a projection of yourself to what you think other people want to see, right? And this is really Brene Brown's work, right?
Yeah, it is. And what you're also talking about is energy management. So you always have a tremendous amount of energy, and that ability to lie down when you're tired, despite your busy schedule, and I presume you don't do this in surgery, but
yeah,
is key, because you're listening to your body. And what we're often doing nowadays is, I'm tired, so I'm going to just get more coffee, which what it ends up doing is just jerking your nervous system back into a state of alertness when your body is tired. When you do that continuously day after day after day, you're just creating exhaustion in your system. But if you actually listen and plug out and relax, the other thing about relaxing, like you said, is when we're calmer, we are so much more emotionally intelligent and make better decisions. And in the US, if you ask people to define happiness, they use terms like excitement and thrill, high intensity emotions. And if you ask people in East Asian countries, Korea, Japan, China, what is happiness, they use words like calmness, contentment, and peace. So all of these emotions are positive, but there's high intensity versus low intensity. And if you think about it, in the US, we value high intensity at play, and we value high intensity at work because we think we have to live on this adrenaline-filled life. So we're constantly in this state of that is actually activating the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight. Whether it's positive or negative, it will activate it when it's in a mode of high intensity. And yet relaxation and calmness, which is not a very sexy term, like you don't say, oh, I'm so calm to see you next week. Like we just would never say such a thing. And yet,
I'm about to fall asleep.
But calmness and that relaxation is the ability for us to manage our energy. And I was just also reading Amy Cuddy's new book, which is also a New York Times bestseller, Presence. It's really beautiful. And she interviews a very famous actress whose name I'm forgetting. But this actress said, when I was first an actor, I thought that I had to portray the emotions by pulling up all of my own internal angst and feelings. And she says, and now later I realize it's all about relaxation and surrendering. And in that moment, she could be her greatest actress. So there's so much, I remember that because I think that can be applied to all of our lives.
But we were talking about in the operating room falling asleep, though, but what I do in the operating room, because it can be slightly emotional and stressful, is actually periodically I just stop for a moment and just breathe and recenter myself to be able to really be present, because you do start feeling fatigue, and if you're absolutely focused for a long period of time, it does wear on you. But when you step back for just less than a minute or two and just do some breathing back and forth and shut your eyes and be there, again, at least for me, it has this incredible renewing effect to give me energy and to be refocused again. Well, it's really been wonderful chatting, and I'm sure Em and we hang out and love to just talk with each other, and you're sort of in our living room, I guess. But I'd like to see if anybody has questions. There are microphones on either side. Feel free to go, and we'll just engage some question-answer for a little bit here. So please go up to the microphone.
Thank you for a lovely conversation. Forgive me if I'm not going to articulate this, because it just kind of popped into my mind that you started at some point talking about empathy, and if somebody walks into the room and they're angry or if they feel good, you feel that because there's communication on other levels. And then you went to this other part of being confronted by somebody angry outside and feeling attacked. And I'm just wondering, isn't that in some level another feeling of empathy? But the difficulty is not being able to separate those feelings that might be projected by this other person, because you're empathizing, you're feeling that same anger, but you're not able to separate and say, that's that person.
I think thanks for bringing that up. So psychologists think of empathy as feeling the emotion of another person, whether that's laughter or anger, and then compassion is feeling the suffering of another person, an empathic response, and then being motivated to help. So yeah, absolutely. We don't know when we're picking up somebody else's emotion, and then have you ever had this experience where you're angry and you're like trying to hook it to something? Like, I'm really angry. Why? Because of you. Sometimes because we do pick up these emotions and we don't know why. But it's that very physiological response. But you're absolutely correct.
So that pause is really important, because you might be able to go, that's not me I'm picking it up.
Exactly.
Well, and this is why having that pause allows you to maximize your executive control and be discerning and be more thoughtful and actually interpret that emotional state versus just being reactive to a presumed threat.
Right. And it takes a lot of practice.
Well, yes.
Thank you.
And it's interesting because one of those practices is, in our compassion cultivation course, we teach you to be self-compassionate, but then extend this compassion. And certainly with those you love, it's easy. With those who may have a relationship of some type, which may not be love, but your friends, it's easy. But when you start getting to the neutral and then to the person you don't like, it is a much harder experience. And it does take immense amounts of time, and it does not happen overnight. And just like nothing of value typically drops into your hand, it usually takes some sort of effort. And these types of practices do take effort.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, sir.
I've got a couple questions about breathing techniques. So one is there a way to access the Sudarshan Kriya other than through the Art of Living Foundation? And then the second one is, so I saw your Big Think video on the alternative nostril breathing, and you mentioned the 4-count tactical breathing. Are there other, in addition to the Sudarshan Kriya, are there other breathing techniques that are useful?
Well, I think the tradition of yoga has a number of different practices that you can learn probably in a yoga class that are very effective in the short run, that are effective tools you can use in a moment of stress or fatigue. They're fantastic, and you can learn those from yoga teachers. The Sudarshan Kriya takes a longer time to learn, and from my understanding, you have to learn it with an instructor who's trained. I would suggest that rather than trying to do it in a different way, but I think those are your options.
All right, thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Mr. Doty. Hi, Emma. Y'all briefly mentioned Brené Brown, and she's from Texas, and I'm from Texas as well. This is my first time in California.
Thank God you came to this bastion of liberalism.
So I was just wondering if, Emma, if you could expand upon your post the other day on Facebook about what Brené Brown said about having compassion, but also recognizing that there are boundaries needed as well. So self-care, but also having compassion for others.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw this video. I think you would like it. It's profound what she was sharing. She says, when you have strong boundaries, you can love more and you can be more compassionate. And then she also says, I'm not as nice as I was, but I'm a lot more loving. I thought it was very powerful. And what we do know from research on empathy and compassion is that sometimes when you over-empathize with another person and you start to feel their distress or you feel distressed, then you're not able to help them as much. So being able to have that boundary and that ability to be contained in the face of suffering, you may feel the suffering but not be so overwhelmed, and that you can actually think more clearly and rationally about what is the best step to help them. But honestly, I found that video so profound that I'm still digesting it, because I think there's a lot of wisdom there, said in very few words. And Dr. Doty, I mean, you're always dealing with so much suffering in your profession, day after day, and you have people coming in with so much pain. And you have an incredible ability to both be compassionate, but you also have good boundaries that allow you to be helpful.
Well, one of the challenges is because I see tragedy every day. I mean, horrible tragedy. In fact, just before I came over, I was talking to a woman about her mother who came to the ER after seizure, and she has a highly malignant brain tumor. And, I mean, this is a tragedy, right? A person who just the day before was doing okay, seemingly. And the thing is, and, for any of you who've come to our things, I can be quite emotional, get teary, and my voice will crack, and I don't deny that. My wife says I'll cry at a Lassie show. But I am able to be there and to really connect with them, but it never takes me over the edge. And I'm fortunate that way, because some people, like I have physician colleagues who they cannot do that. It requires so much of them that what they end up choosing to do, which I think is sad, is to separate themselves always and to get away from any type of emotional feelings in that regard. And this is why you hear these horrible stories where, well, the doctor walked in and told me my mother had a malignant brain tumor, then he walked out the door. You go, oh my God, how could you even possibly do that? But this happens, and I get notes or emails about this all the time. But I think it does take practice, and the absolute critical thing is you do have to have boundaries. It's not that you don't love, it's not that you don't care, it's not that you don't connect, but you don't get lost in it and go over. Because once you go over, you are drowning, and there's no life preserver. And this is why, the incidence of burnout in caregivers, because caregivers, by their nature, are there for you. But the reality about caregivers also is many of them have suffered deeply, and that's why they become caregivers, because they know what pain is like. But oftentimes they don't have boundaries. So, yes, sir.
Yes, this is in regard to altruistic behavior. Could it be seen that humans are willfully blind to it based on a narrative that's been dictated to us in indoctrination of like Calvinism and the merger of capitalism, that we have to compete in order to survive, acquisition, power, those are the goals, and once we go into that particular mode, we're blind to the altruistic behavior within us, because if the narrative changed, we could change with it. Even the newer generations, if they hear a different story, they can follow that. But the stories that we hear in our history and the acquisition of our knowledge and our nature, that's what we know and that's what we strive for.
Well, it's interesting because people often say, well, it's survival of the fittest. What are you talking about? That's how we evolved, right? But actually, and Dr. Keltner over at the Greater Good Center has really strongly made this point, is that that was not Darwin's message. People think Darwin said survival of the fittest. But actually that was coined by Herbert Spencer, who was a social Darwinist who had an agenda to justify racial and social hierarchies. And everyone took that to be, okay, that's what Darwin said. But Darwin actually said something more akin to the fact that in order for us to survive, we would have needed what he called sympathy so much. I mean, just look at us. Our skin is so vulnerable. We're so fragile. We're so pierceable. We don't even have claws. We don't have fangs. We have nothing. All we have is each other. And so in order to have survived, we needed each other. And that is more akin to Darwin's message. But you're right. Economists have long touted this idea of self-interest. That's what motivates us. But psychologists are proving those economists wrong again and again because we don't always act in our self-interest. And compassion is one of the prime examples, but others as well.
It's interesting. People quote Adam Smith sometimes, but what's his book?
Wealth of Nations?
Well, there's another one, though, that talks about connection with everybody whose name I can't. The name of which I can't recall, but it's an incredible
But what
book.
I'm saying here is that we have no control over it because of the system process. See, the hegemony is forcing us to act in a certain way.
Well, I think if you're talking about Western capitalism, that's the nature of our culture, right? If you look at Northern European countries, such as Finland, Denmark, Norway, their culture is quite a bit different. I think that there is a sense sometimes that, it's a rugged individualist, and, I take what I want, and I did it, and everyone else should have to do it because I was able to do it, which, of course, is completely not true at all. But this is, in some ways, about being self-aware. And again, it gets back to the comment that I made. You can't release yourself from a prison unless you realize you're in a prison. And cultural definition is something that's an artificial construct. And once you have awareness of that, it allows you freedom to live the life you choose. And each of us has that. It's just like we have the freedom to imbue these practices and change our lives in a very positive way, while doing so, helping ourselves and profoundly helping other people. It's your choice. But you have to be aware that there is choice.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I've got a very subtle question. I'm hoping I can illustrate it with a bit of a story. This morning at 6:30, I was a few hundred yards over that way in a giant basketball court with a few hundred devoted yogis, and I'm kind of a beginner, and we were working out, you might say, doing the Ashtanga series under the guidance of one of the most famous yoga instructors of the world, Mr. Joyce, whose grandfather invented this brand. And I got to ask a question after all of the practice and, an hour of sitting down listening. There were a handful of questions. And mine was basically, I'm a new yogi, I am a scientist, I think of my life and my decisions in scientific terms, and I'd like to know what scientific book you'd recommend to illustrate the mechanisms of yoga. We didn't hear that well. It was a noisy communications channel. But what he said was basically, you don't need science. Yoga is within you. You don't need proof. The proof is within you. And that is absolutely true. I actually have no problem. I believe it. I understand how moving in a room together in synchrony with a bunch of other people and a common intention and an audible breath bathing us all, how that can actually lead to a wonderfully resonant, actual psychological state. I lived it. I think a lot of other people in the room lived it too. I have no question about the reality. But I have a similar sort of question here. You've been talking about emotional contagion and connection and self-awareness and other terms which describe things which are real, but when it comes to science, it's usually science to prove it exists, to show there is an effect, rather than to show the suppleness of what is an emotional contagion. Which muscles move? Is there some electromagnetic signal? Is it a high-frequency audio signal? I mean, what signals are our brains sending to our bodies and to each other which implement these things? So how we can know the mechanisms and thus actually use them beyond merely saying, wow, an fMRI study showed the hippocampus got bigger. Do you have any favorite theories or books or understandings of the actual biological implementation and functions of these things we're living?
So I think that this field is in development, and there is a lot of research out there. I don't know if there's a recent book summarizing all of it, although Dr. Doty's book goes a lot into the science of compassion and empathy. But there's a lot of new research coming out all the time exactly about the kinds of things you're mentioning. In fact, I just met with Michael Krauss at Yale, who's one of our affiliate scientists, and so we know that we capture a lot of other people's emotions just through eye gaze. Through meeting someone else's eyes, you register and you can read a lot of their emotions. And you can look online, there's a test called Reading the Eyes in the Mind, and the New York Times actually published the study, so you can actually do it yourself. But in some of this new data is showing that we're even more accurate at discovering someone's emotion or detecting someone's emotion through our ears when we're only hearing the voice. So it's a fascinating topic, and there's a lot more research. And
I think this Handbook of Compassion Science will give some more information summarizing some of that research. But you have to understand the field of the science of compassion and these emotional states are still in their infancy. And so I think a lot of this we're still learning about.
I guess those are the usual answers that the science called evidence-based science gives. it does an experiment and gives an answer, this thing is true and this thing works. I'm wondering if there's a theory, if there's a common theory for the eyes and the ears and the body, all of it together, so that we don't need to keep looking up lots of different research projects.
Well, this gets into the debate of experiential life and a life of evidence-based. And there's no question, you look over thousands of years, that there has been a lot of work done on creating, especially in Tibetan Buddhism as an example, of a taxonomy of the inner life or the mental life. And that's there, it's valid, and this is why scientists are attracted to it. But, and some people would say you don't need the other. It's all experiential, and being with somebody who can transmit that experience and teach you how to have that experience, what does it matter whether you know the exact pathway?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. One more question. Unfortunately, we're going to be out of time.
Yes, Dr. Doty and Emma, it's such a privilege to have you guys here in this kind of
Dr.
setting.
Seppala, so I have to acknowledge.
To
Even
have
though
you here.
medical doctors are.
But anyways, the question of well-being and healing is and the question that I had, the role that of faith and religion and God plays in the healing process and the well-being and happiness is, I understand, is a very broad discussion. I would love to have time to talk. But I'm just curious, as you as a medical doctor in the area of people having a positive faith outlook, and then also in the area of Emma, in the area of healing and happiness, and the role that faith could play and God in a rapid or quicker healing rate, or maybe successful healing through surgery and so forth. I was just kind of curious to see if you guys have had discussion or research in those areas.
Well, I don't want to head off too much into God and religion, but I will tell you, I believe in nothing. So I have no belief in a God, and to me it's all random. But that being said, I do believe that we are here, and while we're here, the best way I can be alive is to care for others, be of service to others, and connect with others. Now that works for me because I don't have this existential crisis of needing to know if I did something and get massively rewarded at the end of the day. But for other people that is important, and that's okay too. But it gets back in some ways to this placebo effect. As an example, we know that Republicans and religious people, because of certainty, actually live longer. Did you know? I'm not telling you to go vote Republican. But the reason I say that is this has to do with belief. If you have absolute belief that, let's say, when you die, it's all going to be okay, and you're either going to be rewarded or whatever, and you truly believe that, that will give you a sense of calmness. And that's why religious people or people have some political views that they're very righteous about, because they then get into this calm state. As an example, you could have a very religious, as an example, a Christian person who some threat has occurred, and they start praying, and they become very relaxed, and they kick into their parasympathetic nervous system. And in fact, they'll sit there and forgive the person right there as they're about to injure them. But this is the power of mental processes. And I won't comment whether it's religion or belief in God, but what we do know is that by these types of practices or training, you can shift to be in a state where, from a physiologic best practice, if you will, that's where you're meant to be. When you are able to shift over to this parasympathetic nervous system, you have a change in your genetic expression, your immune system is boosted, your stress hormones are decreased down to baseline level, your cardiac function works better, your peripheral vascular system works better, and actually you increase the length of your telomeres. So everything tells us, and you could argue it's simply based on physiology over time and evolution. Some people could say it's based on belief in God. But we do know, and getting back to this individual who talked about experiential, it is what it is, right? Mm-hmm. And that's all we can do.
So you would encourage that?
Pardon?
You would encourage that type of prayer?
I would encourage any practices that make you be the best person that you can be and care for others. Okay. Because when you do that, you have a life of meaning. And at the end of the day, that is what we want for ourselves, and that's what we want people to remember us by.
Thank you.
Thank you.